think it slipped down. All right, it's slipping a little bit. Hello, everybody. Today we're gonna be doing a summary of chapter 2. He said, "Don't talk to you." Chapter 2 of summary for Autobiography of Malcolm X, as told to Alex Haley. Here we go. Chapter 2. The title of chapter 2 is Mascot. The chapter starts on June 27th, 1973. Malcolm recently turned 12 years old at this time. Joe Louis had become the first Negro to win the heavyweight championship in boxing. This gave a sense of pride to Negroes in America, something you can compare to Obama winning the presidency in 2008. Every Negro wanted to be the next Joe Louis. Malcolm's older brother, Filbert, was a good boxer, but Malcolm was focused on basketball. Filbert got serious and became an amateur boxer. This made Malcolm a little bit jealous. So Malcolm starts boxing. At the age of 13, he was 128 pounds. Malcolm lost his first fight to a white boy named Bill Peterson. While people are laughing at Malcolm for losing to white boys, his older brother Filbert was becoming more successful. This put even more pressure on Malcolm. Now he had the reputation of losing to a white boy. The best careers for Negroes at this time were sports and entertainment, so you were expected to be better in those fields than whites. So Malcolm goes back to the gym and trained harder until he was ready. Trained hard until he was ready to get back in the ring. He signed up for a rematch with Bill Peterson. Malcolm gets knocked out immediately. He eventually gives up boxing. He naturally gives up boxing at this point. And he believes it was Allah's will for him to stop boxing. Sometime after he gave up boxing, Malcolm gets into trouble wearing a hat in class. The teacher was white and told Malcolm to walk around the class repeatedly. Malcolm put a tack in the teacher's chair during one of the laps, and when the teacher sat down, he hurt himself. Malcolm was expelled from the school. He was scheduled to be sent to a reform school, but instead he was sent to a detention home in Mason, Michigan. The Swerlins were a couple that ran the detention home. It was a big, brawly lady and a small, frail, older white guy. The lady ran the detention home. Eating dinner with the Swerlins was Malcolm's first time eating with whites. He says, quote, "I noticed how white people smelled different from us and how their food tasted different, not seasoned like Negro cooking," unquote. Malcolm became accepted by whites in a detention home, but he felt he was only accepted as, quote unquote, a mascot, hence the title of the chapter. The whites in the detention home would talk about everything and use the word nigger as though Malcolm wasn't even there. Mrs. Swerlin once said, quote, "I just can't see how those niggas can be so happy and be so poor," unquote. Malcolm began to hang out in the black parts of Mason. He would stare at blacks in the bars and restaurants and hear music from artists that he would eventually know personally once he got to Harlem. Miss Swerlins was able to pull some strings to keep Malcolm from going to the reform school, and he was able to go to Mason Junior High. Malcolm expresses a high level of for some reason out of nowhere, Malcolm expresses a high level of respect for the Lyons family. This was one of the families that was at his father's funeral, and one of the black families in Mason. They had attended the school with him. That's why he talked about him. Malcolm was the only black in his class, however. He says, quote, as the nigger of my class, I was in fact extremely popular, end quote. Miss Swerlins was well known in the town, so Malcolm having her approval, he gained everyone else's approval. Nobody really wanted to go against Mrs. Swerlins or anybody that she was in her good graces. Malcolm joins every school Oh no, Malcolm joined several school activities. They mentioned basketball and the debate team for two, but they said he joined as many as he could. Miss Swirlins also found Malcolm a job washing dishes. He talks about how much he loved getting paid on Fridays. He was 12 years old at this time. Malcolm's favorite subject in school were English and history. He disliked math. He said that there were no arguments in math. Either it is or it isn't. The second semester of the seventh grade, Malcolm gets elected as class president. He had the highest grades, and the fact that he was black made him unique. At this time, he says he was, quote unquote, trying to be white. This phase of his life was part of the reason Malcolm felt integration was a waste of time. Malcolm would often visit the Lyons family. He recalls having the same warm feelings as he would have when he visited his siblings or the Gohannes family in Lansing. As Malcolm turned 14, he started to go to Lansing every Saturday. Lansing was where his brothers and sisters were. Wilfred and Hilda still lived in the house that their father built. Hilda took care of the house while Wilfred read books and worked. Filbert continued to develop Filbert, his other older brother, continued to develop as a boxer. Reginald and Wesley were living with the Williams family, while Yvonne and Robert were at the home of Miss McGuire. His family was all over Lansing. When they were all together, him and his brothers and sisters, they rarely talked about their mother, and they never talked about their father. Sometimes they would visit their mother at the facility at Kalamazoo. Towards the end of Malcolm's 7th grade career, Malcolm's oldest sister, Ella, came to visit. Some of his brothers and sisters were writing to Ella, asking her to come visit. Malcolm's first impression of Ella was, quote, I think a major impact of Ella's arrival, at least upon me, was that she was the first really proud black woman I had ever seen in my life, end quote. And she was a jet black woman. She was a commanding woman, bigger than Mrs. Swirlins. Ella was a woman that did and got what she wanted. Malcolm remembers what his father had told him about Ella, how she was able to succeed in the North after moving from the South with nothing. Ella became successful by investing in property. Ella more than lived up to the reputation that their father had given. Malcolm said, quote, he had never been so impressed with anybody, unquote. Malcolm and Ella talked about Malcolm. Malcolm and Ella talked about Malcolm in school. They talked about his grades. They talked about how he was elected president, him being one of the top 3 students in the class. Ella talks to Malcolm about their brother and sister, Earl and Mary, who are still in Boston. Ella also tells Malcolm stories about their family. I'm assuming stories about the family, before Malcolm was born, or stories about their father that he may not know about. Ella suggested that the whole family go see their mother. Somehow, with either luck or a miracle, Ella was able to connect with Malcolm's mother. Malcolm says, quote, Ella had everything in hand, and we left with all of us feeling better than we ever have about the circumstances, end quote. Ella left Lansing a few days later and went back to Boston. Ella invited Malcolm to visit Boston that summer. This is the summer of 1940, and Malcolm would be 15 years old at this time. Malcolm said he arrived at Boston looking like, quote unquote, a hick. He had a green suit, but he was starting to outgrow it, and he had his kinky red hair. In those days, blacks sat in the back of the bus. He remembers that it was a long ride that seemed to take forever, and the ride took a day and a half by bus. Ella picked Malcolm up and took him back to her place. She lived at Wambach Street in the Sugar Hill section of Roxbury. Malcolm referred to this area as, quote, the Harlem of Boston, unquote. Ella was with her second husband at this time, and she was busy with her involvement in local organizations. She was, quote, a leading light in the black society. Being in Boston allowed Malcolm to see people in larger numbers than he had ever seen before. especially in the clubs, pool halls, bars, and in the streets. These are black people. He just never seen so many black people together. Malcolm would hear music from some of the artists that he would eventually know personally, such as Duke Ellington, Cootie Williams, and Erskine Hawkins. The biggest bands played at Roseland State Ballroom on Boston, Massachusetts Ave. It was a popular place for blacks and whites, although events were still segregated at that time. They would have one night for blacks, one night for whites. Malcolm had seen mixed couples before living in Lansing, but he had never seen it done openly like in Boston. He would see black and whites arm in arm. He saw huge churches that blacks would attend like he had never seen before. They were, quote, quote unquote, finer than the whites churches he had attended at Mason. He noticed the difference in how blacks worshipped. He noticed that blacks were more physically involved in the worship opposed to the whites being more ceremonial. The experience in Boston changed the way Malcolm saw himself as a black person. He no longer felt comfortable accepting the title nigger from whites. At the end of the summer of 1940, Malcolm returns to Mason to start the 8th grade. Malcolm's still 15 years old, obviously. Malcolm couldn't forget the feelings he felt while in Boston. He says, quote, "I know that it was the sense of being a part of a mass of my own kind for the first time," unquote. Everyone around him, who happened to be white, obviously, who happened to be white in Mason, noticed that something was different about him. They would always ask him if he was okay. Malcolm still kept good grades. He was one of the top 3 students. And I'm wondering, is this the same group of people, like the same class that he had in 7th grade, just went to the 8th grade? It's the same 3 people, top 3, I don't know. This is when Malcolm has his infamous conversation with his English teacher, Mr. Ostrowsky. Malcolm looked up to Mr. Ostrowsky as an advisor, and Malcolm performed well in his class. Malcolm spoke with Mr. Ostrowsky about his career goals. Though Malcolm had never really thought about it, he told his teacher that he wanted to be a lawyer. Mr. Ostrowsky responds with the quote, "You've got to be realistic about being a nigger," end quote. He thought Malcolm would be a good carpenter because, quote, he was good with his hands, unquote. This conversation obviously changes Malcolm's opinion of his teacher. Malcolm noticed how Mr. Ostrowsky would encourage other students' aspirations for the future, even though they had lower grades than Malcolm. Malcolm was learning that black people had a certain position in America. Quote, "Apparently I was not intelligent enough in their eyes to become whatever I wanted to be," unquote. Malcolm began to withdraw from whites. He also began to change his response to the word nigger. His teachers, classmates, co-workers, and even the Swirlins were trying to figure out what is wrong with Malcolm. The Swirlins didn't understand why Malcolm had changed so much in the span of just one trip to Boston. Malcolm was eventually sent to live with the Lyons family. This is the same black family that was at his father's funeral, and it's the only black family in Mason. Malcolm lived with the Lyons while he finished the 8th grade. Every Saturday, he would visit his siblings back in Lansing. Somehow, Ella arranged to take custody of Malcolm, so he moved to Boston at the end of the 8th grade. This was the summer of 1941. Malcolm would be about 16 years old. He says, quote, "No physical move in my life had been more pivotal or more profound." He believes that if he stayed in Michigan, he would become a Negro. No, he would have become like a common Negro. He says, quote, "All praise is due to Allah that I went to Boston when I did. If I hadn't, I'd probably still be a brainwashed Christian." That's the end of the 2nd chapter. Autobiography of Malcolm X, as told to Alex Haley. Check it out yourself. Share this if you like what you heard. And that's about it. I'll see y'all next time. Peace out.